everyone again. And just to say that I've been working in this field of mental health and mental wellness for the past 20 years. And just before COVID, I think most of us, and actually can see some of you here that have joined us who have been working in this field, have already been talking about what I call a looming crisis that is approaching South Africa. And that was what we called the unresolved or untreated trauma or stress. I call it the untreated wounding of our society. And those of us who've been doing this work have been saying that this undealt with wounding, the people I work with in communities call it inxeba lenhliziyo, which is the wound of the heart, was infiltrating all significant areas of the South African life. I mean, from individual to family. I've worked with people in industry, people who lead departments. The powerful statement that one of the leaders said to me was, "Nomfundo, you know, we have people, but we have no workforce because of the high level of depression and mental health issues that we are seeing in relation to our work." SADC has done quite a lot of work in looking at stats. And we had already been making a call even before COVID that there has to be a significant mind shift in our society, where we have to begin to see the psychological, mental health, coaching interventions, not just as a nice to have, but as a critical component of our intervention as a society. That if we are to achieve our developmental goal, our economic goal, our peace building goal, violence prevention goal, we have to deal with the mindset of South Africans. We have to deal with the unresolved depression and trauma at all different levels. So these were all the conversations that were happening in various corners of South Africa. So when COVID-19 came in and hit our society, I think most of the people that I know in this sector just said, we are concerned. We are concerned that the devastation is not just gonna be on our physical health, it's gonna be on our economic well-being. And I think there's been an awakening in our society in dealing with the economic issues and the inequality issues and the food. But I think most of us have also been saying that the impact is going to be psychological. This COVID was likely to exacerbate a situation that was already fragile. And so when I was invited by AVPA to lead this initiative, and because of just the connection and the capacity of AVPA to galvanize a national initiative, I was so excited to be part of this. And I'm glad that all of you are here to join us in this ambitious initiative that we have, to begin to see how we create more synergy, collaboration, and ensure that our interventions are sustainable. I have had an honor of meeting amazing people in South Africa doing great work in relation to addressing the issues of mental health, mental wellness, coaching, life coaching. And I think there really is a need. It is timely for us to have an initiative that bring this together and ensure that there's a lot of synergy. So what we are hoping to do today, the first thing is, if by the time we leave here, we would have highlighted the importance of wellness, if all the over 100 people that have joined us today, the 165 participants, will leave this meeting saying, definitely, we cannot afford to marginalize mental wellness issues in our response to COVID. We can't do the mistake that we did when we were looking at the transitioning of our society after apartheid, when we ignored the mental wellness issues. We have to integrate them. We would have done our job. What will top the issue for us is also if we would have been able to appreciate the scope and the extent of the problem around mental, psychosocial wounding, whatever language you use to explain these issues that affect our minds and our psyche. And finally, we are hoping that we can really begin to initiate, this will be a beginning of launching a platform that ensures that we are working together as the people that are in this sector. We are very clear that we don't want to duplicate what is already happening, but we would like a platform that builds on this. So, and finally, find creative ways of ensuring that the most marginalized people in our society are going to receive this excellent service that most of you are actually already doing. So we are going to start. The people that are presenting, I said to them, they are not presenters, they are really provocateurs because they only have 5 to 7 minutes. What I would like them to do is just to highlight the issues for us and give us a sense of what the interventions will look like. We're not going to ask for questions. I would really ask you to please write on chat if you've got questions or things that you want. After their presentation, we will open up discussions. And when we are opening up discussions, I'll just tell you the things that I would like you to raise in relation to their presentations. So thank you, everyone. I know there is Zoom fatigue, but please just, I invite you to come here and be present. I'm really excited by the presentations that we're going to have. Tracy, if you could please put up the presentation. So the first person that will come in is Casey from SADC, who will really give us just an overview of mental wellness issues and the exciting stats that they have been doing in relation to this issue. So over to you, Casey.
Thank you very much, Nomfundo, and thanks again to everyone. I can see the participants are rising and more people are joining. It's amazing to see everyone joining us from around the country to really start this conversation. So again, thank you for the opportunity and the platform. I only have 7 minutes and I could talk for hours around mental health and mental wellness. So again, this is just to start the conversation and to start the discussions. I'm really looking forward to many discussions, and I know that all the speaker contact details will be given at the end. And I do encourage all the people joining us, engage with us. We really do want to start, more discussions after this. So I'm just really coming in to paint a picture from our experience on the ground. My name is Cassie Chambers. I'm the Operations Director at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. During COVID, for the first time in 26 years, we've had to close our call center and move all of our services remotely and offline, or from home. So we have our amazing volunteers and counselors who've been answering our helplines 24 hours a day. And I just wanted to share some of that experience of what we're seeing on the ground, and know that there is so much information and bombardment of information around COVID-19. So I'm really hoping to offer some insight. During this time specifically, we've been monitoring our calls on a daily basis. Since the beginning of lockdown, the week before, when everyone was in crisis mode, preparing for lockdown, which seems such a long time ago, nearly 8 weeks. And then since lockdown, we've just seen the calls increasing on a daily basis. Before lockdown, we were receiving on average 600 calls per day. We're now getting over 1,200, 1,400 calls per day, and that's just incoming calls. We've seen a massive spike in the number of people texting us, going on our WhatsApp chat, sending emails, even engaging on our daily Facebook chats. So many people are looking for information and resources and are just not coping. And again, this is completely understandable for the crisis that we're going in. Mental health was always very under-resourced before COVID, and it was already a crisis. And I think during COVID, and from the experiences that we've seen from overseas, mental health needs to be made a priority. One of the initiatives that we did during COVID, and if I can just go to the next slide, please, Tracy, is we did an online survey just before the announcement for the second extension. Was just to really understand from people on the ground, what was their experiences, what were they battling with, what were their challenges. We're very aware that this is an online survey, so it's only for certain target audience who have access to online resources, emails, websites, internet, data, which is a huge luxury in South Africa. So we know that this is not nationally representative, but at least it gives us some insight into what people are dealing with. The online survey was actually just conducted over 10 days, and we had over 1,200 participants who gave us feedback. And I think that just gives us an idea, numbers as to, we're knowing from our side what we're talking on, what people are calling us for, but to really understand from people. So I wanted to share some of those stats today, just to start us thinking, and hopefully in whichever project or area of work that you're in, hopefully this is helpful. I'm also very happy to make these infographics available on the website, Nomfundo. We can find different ways of sharing that information. when we're looking at the general views around lockdown and the impact on mental health, so people went into lockdown feeling very stressed and anxious. And then during lockdown, 65% of people felt incredibly stressed. And I think that is concerning, but very normal since everyone in South Africa was affected by lockdown. Something interesting that came out of the study too was that 92% supported the lockdown. So we understood the regulations, we believed in the restrictions, and no one had any problems with it. And I think that just shows you South Africans understanding that this is a massive issue. Sorry, Tracy, next slide, please. So we saw obviously majority females were on the survey versus male. Another concerning stat for us was the number of unemployed people during lockdown. 38% of people who filled in the online survey were unemployed. It'd be really interesting if that same survey was done now, nearly 8 weeks into COVID-19 lockdown, to see how many more people would be unemployed. Another concerning fact there was the number of people who were doing lockdown by themselves. Talk about social isolation, not just physical distancing. 16% of people lived alone. And perhaps for the first 3 weeks of lockdown, that was manageable, and maybe with the extension. But we underestimate the impact of loneliness on our mental wellness. Next slide, please. Some of the interesting things that also came out is that 59% of people before lockdown had already reported a mental health issue, mainly depression, anxiety, and bipolar. Some of the key things that people were sharing as to what helped them cope during lockdown and to help their mental wellness is keeping busy, some kind of physical activity, chatting to someone, having a meaningful, connected conversation, watching their favorite movie or TV show, doing some housework, and that I think is a little bit debatable, sharing a meal with family. Again, it's about that social relationships and connection, and doing some remote work, feeling a purpose. You know, a lot of people that we're speaking to now, 8 weeks into it, the level of boredom, the ideas of their Pinterest ideas of what they were going to do during lockdown, we underestimate the complacency that so many people experience. My last slide, sorry Tracy, if we can go through there, was just to really understand some of the main issues that people contacted us and filled in with regards to the survey. If we can just go to the next slide, thank you. Obviously, anxiety and panic was the main issue that people reached out to us. Again, financial stress and pressure. We're getting lots of SMSs and contacts from people who were employed a month ago, had a job, and now they're standing in a queue for a food parcel for their families. We also understand 40% with depression, then poor family relations. We've seen a huge spike in gender-based violence and people who just don't feel safe at home, and then feelings of suicide, and then substance abuse. Something interesting is that during this time, obviously people are going online to get information, wanting to access things at their fingertips. And I think this just shows us what so many South Africans across the country are dealing with, and that roller coaster of emotions. So I hope that adds some kind of insight around mental health. One of the things that we're at SADAG really keen to do and to engage in conversation is that, again, South Africa was very proactive in instilling these regulations a lot earlier than other countries, and we're learning from other countries' experiences and perhaps some of their mistakes. However, we have the opportunity to be more proactive and try to do a lot more preventative mental health awareness instead of always reactionary. So those are my 5 to 7 minutes, Nopunda. I hope I kept within time. I'm really going to pass the baton on to the next experts and really look forward to ongoing conversations.
Okay. Thank you. And you kept to time. You gave us so much under such in just such a short space of time. So thank you very much, Casey. I think that just paints the picture of the situation before and during COVID. So what we're going to do now is to go to Prof. Malusilanga from West University, who has done a lot of work together with the students at a community level. So we just have a sense of what is happening within the communities in South Africa and how is COVID affecting them. Prof, are you there?
Yeah, I was here. I'm not sure if colleagues can hear me.
Yes, we can. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you now. 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, I mean, good afternoon, and thanks, Nomfundo, for the invitation, and also, I guess our guest. Thanks very much, and I'll try and stick to my 7 minutes, which is highly impossible. But I guess my contribution, obviously, I mean, will build up on the previous presentation on the issue of mental health, and I think it is very clear from the presentation made that there is no doubt that COVID-19 has exacerbated existing mental health difficulties, as shown in the previous presentation. To say our stats when come to anxiety, depression, and other related issues have increased. But I guess my key concern, I mean, I guess it is as if now we've divided our lives into two. We talk about prior COVID-19, post COVID-19. But obviously, I mean, the issue of mental health, especially its impact on communities, is highly noted in different research reports. But obviously now it does appear that COVID-19 has created a lot of mental health challenges for communities. And I'll run through some of my observations, and also the reports that we've been getting from different sources. That obviously, I mean, this pandemic has created what others call an invincible fear of the other. Obviously, I mean, creating high levels of suspiciousness of the other as a carrier of the virus. And obviously, as a result of that, it has killed that spirit in communities, that spirit of neighborhood. You're my neighbor. In the morning, I can wake up and say hi to you. I can meet you on the street, and we greet sort of each other. So obviously now there's this suspiciousness of the other as a carrier of the virus, and obviously that has created a lot of stigma and discrimination. And when you read even on social media, there have been reports where there will be an allegation that so and so has been diagnosed with COVID-19, and at times it could be a relative. And on the basis of that, there is a discrimination. There have been reports of where there will be workers working in a particular community, and obviously, I mean, living in another area. And in that area, there may have been, again, allegations to say someone has been diagnosed with COVID-19. On the basis of that, people coming from that community, they get discriminated on the basis of that. And obviously, I mean, if I go briefly internationally, I mean, with what has been happening in China, where African nationals were being sort of attacked, there is also that possibility that this may happen in South Africa. But also, I mean, the disruption of what I call community networks, because often, I mean, I've done a lot of work in communities around the Vale of Stockville meetings, and also, I mean, the networks that you see amongst street vendors, and the sense of unity that emerges out of community gatherings, including going to church, going to a soccer match, and all these gatherings, which often will happen in communities, cannot happen as a result of this. So obviously, I mean, that sense of oneness, that sense of community, it's affected as a result of this. And also the feelings of uncertainty of what the future sort of holds. And the other concern that I have, it's about, based on my previous work, it's on the patronage system. That obviously it appears that what COVID-19 has done has brought back has brought a different type of patronage system, in which it is alleged that food parcels are given along political lines or political affiliations. And it is further reported that some leaders have been stealing food parcels or using funds meant for social relief, for personal use. Obviously, here in hearing all these stories, I rely heavily on the report that I did with colleagues entitled "The Smoke That Calls," which I guess if you read that report, it explains this phenomenon much more in details. That obviously COVID-19 has further created another opportunity for political entrepreneurs, or what others call political hyenas, to loot the public purse. And not long ago, we glued on our TV screens talking about state capture, and I foresee another state capture inquiry out of COVID-19 sort of funds. And also, the protest that may also emerge out of this. And the few other points is the militarization of lockdown regulations. And obviously on this point about the militarization, that obviously it has resulted in an increased number of cases and assault by law enforcement officials. And we've seen all kinds of videos being shown where law enforcement officials are forcing citizens to do all kinds of things doing push-ups, rolling over the mud and jumping and being pushed into vents. And obviously the trauma associated with that and its impact on communities often is not sort of spoken about. And also the fear that I guess this is sort of created. And the last two points before I move into my conclusion is that obviously this pandemic has created so much panic, but also it is as if prior COVID-19 we have not had other issues. And the concern that I have is that all the resources now may be diverted to dealing with COVID-19 at the expense of other sort of challenges. And obviously this takes me to my concluding sort of remarks, that often when we talk about mental health services, we even with stats that get collected, more often it's about the impact of whatever that we are faced with on individuals, but not on a community as a whole. So obviously, even with the interventions that we have, it's about individual sort of services, but there are no services that are geared towards providing health services in communities. So obviously here I make an argument, for the need to support community initiatives that I guess facilitate social and civic cohesion. That obviously this pandemic has clearly disrupted ways of life in communities, and we need to find other ways of still facilitating social and civic cohesion, and also providing, I guess, therapeutic and debriefing services to communities. I guess including even community workers who many of them are providing all kinds of services. And of course, my colleague will talk more on this. The compassion fatigue that may result as a result of having to be a frontline worker, but also promoting equal access to mental health resources and a protection of human rights. And we know that access to mental health services prior COVID-19 was a major problem. And of course now maybe this opens a new conversation to say, how do we ensure that everyone has access to mental health services? Because in response to this, some of us as psychologists were very quick in demanding that medical aid schemes pay for online services. But of course, we know those services are only accessible to very few sort of individuals, and communities are left on their own in terms of access to mental health services, and the provision of mental health services to vulnerable communities. Because more often when we talk about communities, I always ask to say what communities are we referring to? And what is a community? And more often, are we referring to formal townships? Are we referring to informal settlements? Are we referring to rural areas? Are we referring to homeless people? Are we referring to foreign nationals? So it is important to know that within each community, there are many communities. You know, for an example, you have children, but also with children, I can say you have local children, you have foreign children, you have men, you have women, you have prisoners. So given all these differences, we cannot have one size fits all mental health interventions. And I guess that would be sort of my conclusion.
It would be really interesting as we discuss to hear how other people are ensuring creative ways of that of access to services for those who need it the most. Thank you very much, Prof, for that. So we're going to move now to the next slide. Thank you, Tracy. This is a topic, those of you who've had me talk in various platforms, is a topic that is very close to my heart, the topic of leadership. And how do we begin to deal with those that are at the forefront of doing this work? I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to a colleague asking them, what are you doing to take care of yourself? They were saying, we're taking care of frontline workers. And I was saying, but what about you as the leaders? Because you are the ones at the forefront. What's going to happen? And sometimes we really neglect. And we all know the mindset of a leader influences how they lead, the decisions they make, and the interaction with people and their capacity to contain others. So I'm really glad that we are pushing under this initiative to focus on this. And I know that most of you in here are actually leaders. So I'm really curious as to what are you doing to take care of yourself? Because we are gonna need you after all of this to help South Africa to move forward. So over to you, Eva.
Hello, everybody. My name is Eva Gash. I feel very privileged to be part of this initiative. Also joined the initiative about, well, kind of around the time when the whole COVID thing started, and really just in an attempt to kind of, how can I help? What can I do? Is there anything I can do to help? And particularly to help people in kind of underprivileged areas and situations. And so my background is I worked in human resources for many years in various companies. And for the last 2 years, I've been doing leadership coaching independently. And so therefore, I was kind of happy to take the lead on the leadership side of this. And I think, you know, the reality is, and as Nomfundo was just saying, as an introduction, is we often think of leaders that are people in organizations, in big corporates, government, you know, those kind of key sectors. But the reality is that, particularly in this situation, we are all leaders. So we're looking at, our focus here is really to look at all leaders from all sectors. So that would be government, corporates, SMEs, NGOs, community organizations, schools, principals, teachers, and then also parents in their own homes, because the reality is that if one is a parent, one really needs to provide leadership to your family and to everyone that you interact with. So as a starting point, the definition of leaders that we're looking at here is really broad, and I think that's really important to highlight. The next point that I wanted to make is that research has shown that 1 in 4 people will struggle with a mental health issue at some point in their lives. And infectious disease outbreaks increase the likelihood of the onset and or deterioration of such issues. And we have a situation, I guess, you know, we've been in this situation now for, between 7 and 8 weeks. The level of uncertainty and the lack of control has just increased week by week. And the reality is that the weight on the leaders that the leaders have had to bear in all of this time is increasing because the demands are just so diverse. Thinking about, how do I look after my staff? How do I protect staff? How do I protect my family? How do I protect people in my organization? But also at the same time, needing to survive economically. So this dichotomy of, you know, wanting to look after people as a leader, but also knowing that we need to survive economically. So there really is huge pressure on leaders, and it just you know, kind of increases all the time. I think we find ourselves in a situation now where quite a few leaders are already operating in a kind of survival mentality mode. So because the levels of stress are already so high, there will be leaders that are already starting to experience burnout, fatigue, depression. And that's where we are at right now. We haven't even kind of gotten into our peak, as they say. And then we need to think about what happens after the peak and after in that whole recovery phase. And so the importance of leaders here, and the importance of leaders getting support in this time, is really once we get through all of this and we need to rebuild our country and our organizations, our schools, our businesses, etc., etc. We really need these leaders, and we can't afford for leaders to be depleted. So yeah, so that's really kind of where we're going in terms of the fact that some leaders are already in a very difficult space. The other thing that comes in with leaders is you have all your kind of stresses in your leadership role, and trying to contain all of that. But the reality is that we all are human beings. Every leader is also a human being. And so every leader in this time is also experiencing personal issues and personal setbacks. And you know, it doesn't really matter what anyone says. The reality is that your personal and your work life, and particularly in this time where we are all kind of 24/7 virtually on, it's very difficult to actually have those boundaries and to create that space for recharging and for refreshing. And it's almost like you kind of on the go all the time. And so really what that takes me into is, okay, so this is something I just think is one of the greatest metaphors of all times. And this is really the oxygen mask principle, which most of us know, we've heard of, etc. And it's a principle of the importance of having to look after ourselves and giving ourselves an oxygen mask before we can actually help anyone else. And I just think as a leader, and for leaders in this time that are so concerned about everyone else, they do neglect themselves. And maybe sometimes that's unconsciously. It's often not conscious. Just this concept, and then they get to a level of exhaustion, fatigue, which will eventually lead into things like depression and burnout. So I think the oxygen mask principle is just something that every leader, it needs to be top of mind. And then one of the things that we've found in the leadership space, I mean, it's resilience is something, is a term that gets bandied about quite a lot at the moment because of the time we are in. But the reality is that when we have resilience, we are able to bounce back and to just kind of recover from really difficult situations. And we're all in that time now. We're all in this really complicated time where none of us know what's going to happen moving forward. So I think the resilience is one of the muscles that leaders really need to build at this time. Some leaders are already resilient, Some leaders' resilience has been weakened by just the magnitude of everything that's been going on. And so yeah, the importance of resilience, and the slide here I've taken courtesy of the Center for Creative Leadership, and really just three simple practices to look at how can I as a leader strengthen my resilience. The first point around showing up, I think that's one of the biggest things in this time. Showing up, giving your best, doing what you can, and then kind of relinquishing the attachment to the outcome. So, you know, we do what we can, and then we need to let go. We need to stay present. The second point is around shifting our lenses. So taking charge of how we think about this situation of adversity that we're in, and choosing our responses. I think that's really, really key, how we choose to respond. And then a last point on that is exercising compassion for others, but very importantly for yourself. The self-compassion as a leader is huge. And then third and finally, developing a personal why that gives your life meaning. So if you think about times in your life, you know, where you faced setbacks and challenges, and how, when you look back on those times, and how you've recovered, it really ties in with your bigger life purpose. So that is something also just to kind of hold on. And then I'd like to end off and really just to loop back to that principle and that metaphor of using your own oxygen mask before you help others. Really an appeal to leaders to seek help. Some leaders are in environments, for example, in a lot of corporates, they are in environments where there are psychologists, there are employee assistance programs, there are specific programs and specific resources that have been put in place. A lot of other leaders are in environments where those resources are not in place. And so really the appeal, again, as a leader, just an openness and a willingness to access help in this time and to look after oneself. Thank you.
Yeah, just really important points. And thanks everyone. We can see your chats. There's very vibrant discussions and introductions happening, and that's the joy of Zoom, that you can actually hear people's silence discussions whilst also listening. Very important point. And also I think some takeaway homes on what we can do as leaders. And I've had so many of the people I know who are managers and leaders talking just about how fatigued and tired they are. And I always say that if leaders don't deal with their wounding, then they make wounded decisions, and the wound take the forefront, and the goal and purpose take the background. And that's what we will see if we don't invest in ourselves. So we appeal to all of you. Thank you so much, Eva. So over to you, Nondumi. So 5 to 7 minutes, please.
A very good afternoon to all colleagues and the speakers that have spoken prior. I'm going to touch on the issue of gender-based violence and mental health. As colleagues may be aware, there's been various reports across the world showing that gender-based violence has increased during the lockdown. We've seen these reports from France, Australia, China, and in various parts of the world. And of course, South Africa is not unique to that. The UN reported more recently that gender-based violence is a shadow to the pandemic. However, of course, we do know that there are differing views from various experts. I was reading an article just yesterday that was actually contesting that and saying, in actual fact, gender-based violence is a reality for women on a daily basis in this country. What we do know is that South Africa has got extremely high levels of gender-based violence. Some of you may have witnessed the march that took place in 2018, where women were actually calling for the president to prioritize addressing gender-based violence in the country. And again, there was another protest last year to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, where women were actually calling for business to play a role in addressing gender-based violence. So definitely we do know that gender-based violence is extremely high in the country. One thing that we also know is that there are very strong relations between gender-based violence and mental health. I think this has been established within the gender-based violence sector, but the National Strategic Plan that was also launched by the President sometime in the last few days also recognizes the linkages between mental health and gender-based violence and the importance of having to address this too. Now, during the lockdown, we've been largely dependent on statistics coming from the Gender-Based Violence Command Center. We've seen the Minister of Police sharing with us some of the statistics, but of course, I think we do question the reliability of the statistics during this period because A, we are under a lockdown and having to reach the home is proving to be quite difficult, but we also as a country generally have challenges of underreporting as a result of various such as the lack of faith in the criminal justice system and many others. As other colleagues have also mentioned, that what's happened with COVID-19 is that it's exacerbated issues of mental health. We know, and what we're seeing already is that there are issues around food insecurity in the country. As I was saying, that food insecurity is high on the agenda. There's a lot of uncertainty around the future. People are talking about what will happen post-COVID and so forth. And we know that the limitations in terms of movements have also heightened stress levels in the country. Outside of the fact that, of course, the strong linkages that have been established between gender-based violence and mental health. As I mentioned earlier, that the President launched the National Strategic Plan a couple of days back, and one of the areas that the National Strategic Plan to address gender-based violence and femicide in the country touches on is the importance of providing psychosocial services to survivors of gender-based violence. Moving on to the next slide. I have more questions actually than answers at this point. I recently had the opportunity to visit a community in the Limpopo province. It's called Mokopan. I had a conversation with a number of women who are at the forefront of providing services during this particular period. And it became very clear that the stress levels are very high. Some of them went as far as sharing that at this point, we're struggling to get food for communities. People are continuously knocking at our doors. We cannot provide. It is highly stressful. We have survivors who are seeking assistance. And as an earlier speaker mentioned, that oftentimes during pandemics, resources tend to be reallocated or diverted to other areas. And so there is really a shortage of services in communities. But more importantly, the question that I asked is, who then is supporting the community frontline workers in relation to mental health? What we've seen in the space over the years is that financial support for organizations that have been providing psychosocial services to survivors of gender-based violence the organizations have faced a lot of financial constraints over time. So the question is how do we provide, or how do we look at providing support to community frontline workers at this important time? Now, what I also noticed during this particular period is one of the key messages that had been that had been communicated by government during this period is the importance of taking care of your loved ones. And we know that the burden of care is oftentimes placed on women. So during this particular period, the burden is extremely high and it can cause a lot of stress. And it's important for us to look at how then do we ensure that we provide some kind of holistic support to women as they continue to provide this kind of service. Again, we do know social distancing is extremely challenging, and whilst it's important, in various communities, oftentimes we take advantage of existing social support systems for us to get any kind of support. These would be like your neighbors, abogogo, your aunts. Sometimes we actually speak to the people that we are part of Stockfells with. And what's happened at this point is with the social distancing, it's become very difficult for us to actually have conversations with these existing social support systems. And you can imagine the pressure and the stress that the situation has actually brought about. What we're seeing also is interventions during this period is a number of organizations who are engaging in virtual platforms to provide psychosocial services. We need to ask ourselves that whilst this is very important, what does it mean in terms of cost and reach? And as I mentioned, that funding for organizations that have been providing this kind of support over the years has dwindled. And so in light of where we're at now, we need to have serious conversations around how do we ensure that these particular organizations are actually supported throughout this process, and of course post-COVID. I've touched on the fact that lack of funding is just an issue across board. More importantly, of course, for the organizations that really need to provide services during this particular point. I do want to stress as an ending that whilst we are dealing with this particular crisis, let's not lose sight of the crisis that has always existed. The reality of the matter is there is a war that is going on at home. And because of the lockdown at this particular point, it isn't easy to reach the home. We almost assume that it is easy for a survivor to actually pick up a call and to make a call seeking assistance. It's not as easy, particularly if you're living in a home with an abuser, possibly in many situations where you are living in a one-bedroom house with the perpetrator or abuser. It isn't as easy to make that call. So it's been quite difficult to reach the home. And I think it's important that we think about strategies that we need to deploy during COVID, but also post-COVID-19. In ending, I really think it is important that we look at reaching women where they are during the lockdown. And some of those spaces outside of the home, as I've already mentioned, that's a challenge. Hello?
Antumisa?
Hello? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. And some of those spaces or some of these areas that we could look at are spaces like where women are actually coming in to get food parcels. We could use those as spaces where we can try to see if we can intervene or provide some kind of support. We do know that women do go to shops to get food. We do know, yes, largely these are some of the spaces where we can be able to be able to see if we can provide some kind of support for women. So it's important overall for us to really think about how do we reach women where they are at this point during the lockdown, and the home still remains a very big challenge. Thank you.
So very important, very, very important, I think, what you are raising. I'm just going to go to our last speaker. There's quite a few people sending me messages that they need to leave at 2. I see your messages. Before you leave, please drop your contact details, who you are, and just to remind everyone, we have a mapping exercise that we are doing where we are trying to map all the services that were sent together with the email that you received. So please fill in that so we can be able to connect you further. I will hand over now to this really important topic now on both how do we support frontline workers. Over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Nomfundo, and thank you to the previous speakers. Just some beautiful content, and so lovely to see the variety of people that have actually linked on today. We really look forward to collaborating with all of you. So my interest has really been looking at the mental wellness of frontline workers, mainly because I'm actually married to a frontline worker who works with COVID patients and runs an ICU. And so this is very, very real for us, particularly in our own home. So prior to COVID-19 and the impact that it's had, the mental health of frontline workers was already at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, very concerned about the levels of burnout and stress, the long hours, the lack of resources, the stigma around mental health, some of the trauma that they're exposed to. And one of the words that was coming out of the literature was this word of compassion fatigue. So what is compassion fatigue? It's really when you take burnout and you combine that with vicarious trauma or secondary trauma that those frontline workers are experiencing. And you get a concept called compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is when your emotional energy and the expenditure of that exceeds your ability to recover. So you often hear this word, I'm running on empty, there's nothing left, I'm just finished inside, I don't have anything to add. And we're finding that between 60 to 90% of people working on the front line are sitting with compassion fatigue. That's very frightening stats. 90% of doctors under the age of 40 have one or more symptoms of compassion fatigue. That was before COVID-19. So now can you imagine that degree of compassion fatigue, that degree of burnout? We then bring in a global pandemic. What is that going to do to the mental health and the mental wellness of our frontline workers? The second concept that we're seeing that came out of the Ebola crisis and some of the research and literature from countries that are just that much ahead of us in this COVID-19 pandemic is the word moral injury or moral wounding. And I didn't know it existed until my husband came home the one day and he said, you know, I just feel at an ethical and a moral level, I'm being wounded by the decisions I have to make. And so I went to start looking. And there are 4 areas that this moral wounding really takes place in. One is around the allocation of resources, the dilemmas that frontline workers have. They have limited resources, they have triage protocols around ventilators, they have resuscitation protocols. They're not allowed to resuscitate all COVID patients. So ethical dilemmas that in a normal situation they would never have to face, and they suddenly have to face these. Secondly, the decision around caring for severely ill patients where they have limited interventions, they have limited resources, also limited protocols that actually work. And so sitting with this absolute conflict inside themselves where they normally have fairly definitive, here's a diagnosis, this is the treatment protocol that we work with. Around COVID-19, that is changing all the time. A lot of it is anecdotal, so much of it is not even tested as yet. So sitting with those dilemmas. Also, with the dilemma of critically ill patients, some of them dying and unable to actually have family members come in. So family members that normally would help with the psychosocial care of that patient, not being able to do that. And I know certainly with my husband, spending many nights late with a patient because there's nobody else to actually sit with them. And then having to align the patient's needs with their own needs. So again, own needs around their family. So wanting to be there for patients to fulfill their ethical responsibility, but also needing to be there for their families. And in that space, the concern, do I come home? What happens if I infect my family? What are the protocols around COVID-19 in my home space? I don't understand them. What about the stigma for my family? And certainly in the early phases, I know our family at times was given a wide berth. People just didn't know how to deal with us. Again, in the family context, do you touch your wife? Do you sleep separately? How do you handle this? So massive ethical dilemmas for them. And then lastly, their own mental health and physical needs, really juxtaposed to those of their patients. So needing to take a weekend off, needing time out, and just feeling, how on earth can I do that when the patient load is so high, or colleagues are sitting in isolation and COVID themselves. So all of this leads to moral injury. So what is moral injury? It's not a mental illness, but it can lead to mental health issues, negative ideations, depression, post-traumatic stress, suicide, burnout, higher incidence of compassion fatigue. But the interesting thing is that in areas where individuals on a team have been exposed to the same type of things that would cause moral injury, you have some teams that actually come out with post-trauma growth. So what is the difference? Why do you have some with severe burnout and moral injury and others not? And I think this is something that has to inform the mental wellness initiatives that we put in place for frontline workers. The thing that they're finding is that those teams that have had early support at that initial phase of the COVID pandemic, during the epicenter of it, and then into the aftercare phase, those that have had high degrees of support throughout end up with post-trauma growth and not nearly the same incidence of moral injury. And so what does early support look like? Early support looks like informing the frontline workers that you're dealing with around compassion fatigue. What does it look like? What are the things that would lead to it? What can you do about it? Also informing them about the moral decisions that they will be making and having very frank discussions around that. And then once they've had to make those decisions, really holding a space where they're able to process them, because that is where the difficulty comes in. I gave a ventilator to patient A. I could have given it to B, but I chose A. A died. B took a lot longer to die off a ventilator. What if I'd actually given it to patient B? Instead of A, I might have had one person alive and not actually 2 deaths. So this constant stress and anxiety that they sit with around their decisions. The other thing is we're seeing a lot of already the helplines being put in place. SADC has done an amazing job with that. The National Medical Frontline Counselors, providing those support facilities. Also peer support, we're really encouraging that as well. Doctors supporting doctors and having these conversations with each other on a regular basis. The aftercare is also absolutely critical, really creating a space where frontline workers are able to reflect on what has happened, learn from the negatives and the experiences that they've had. Certainly the doctors that were involved in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa are saying this aftercare was absolutely essential. Having a place where that narrative can be reframed, where they can process their grief and their loss. And in this phase, really a very close monitoring of healthcare workers and those that need specialist psychological support being referred for that. So today from my side, it's just a conversation, starting a conversation. It's saying we would like to start building a community of practice around existing initiatives. We would like to connect as a center to really strengthen the resources we have and then ensure sustainability post-COVID, that we really are able to provide input into the mental wellness of frontline workers. So thank you. Nomfundo, back over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just amazed at how much all of you are able to put in such a short space of time. So thank you, thank you, thank you. As you can all hear, I think the issues are huge, they are deep, they are historical, they are intergenerational, institutional, they are affecting all levels of our society. And our aspirations are huge. And we don't have a choice but to have the aspirations that those of us that do this work, together with those that invest in this work, could galvanize our resources and work together towards ensuring that we mitigate the effects of COVID so that we have the people to enable South Africa to move forward. So we are now going to enter into a section where I'm going to open up for people's input. I'm going to ask just two things, please, from you. The first one is if there's any key issues that we might have left out, or if you want to just share with us also a sense of what you are picking up. We're trying to build a picture here of what is the reality for South Africa as it relates to mental wellness. And what I would also like you to also please add is any initiatives or work that you are doing. There's a lot that people have already shared via chat, and thank you very much. We're going to keep all of those networks, initiatives. We want to ensure synergy in the work that we are doing. So I'm just going to open the next 10 minutes for the engagement from the floor. Kim and Eva are going to help me. Please remember, you can raise your hand or just indicate through chat if you want to share something. And thank you to our speakers. Can I please ask you, Tracy has just posted a link, the database that we are trying to develop of the people that are involved in this work. Please fill in that database because it's really going to help us to work with you. So Eva, Kim, just please indicate if there's any people that have raised their hands. Anyone that wants to give an input?
I'm actually going to ask Dr. Lane Benjamin, because some of the frontline workers are actually teachers. And I would love her just to comment possibly on some of the initiatives they're doing that also potentially can come under AVPA.
Okay. Dr. Lane, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you for putting me on the spot. Thank you for all your presentations. It sets a great context for talking about teachers as well. So I think just one of the projects we've been engaged in for a few years is developing trauma-informed systems at schools, because we recognize that trauma has existed for generations in our country, and COVID-19 is another trauma on top of everything else that has been experienced. So our work kind of continues with trying to prioritize the mental well-being of teachers, and also helping them to understand how stress and trauma affects children's capacity to learn at school. So for us, the bigger debate is around not whether we need to return to school, but whether we need to return to the curriculum as it is, and whether this is the time now to actually focus on prioritizing social and emotional learning for not just for learners, but also for teachers. So I find a lot of teachers have found a lot of value in understanding how they self-regulate and how they cope with their own stress, and how that impacts on their classrooms and what learners are bringing into the classroom. So I think, if we can think of schools as a different way of supporting communities, because they create so much access to multiple sectors within a community, and be more creative in the way that we deal with schooling and offer psychosocial and economic support through schools as well. So that's one of the projects I hope we can work on together as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was very useful. Is there any people with questions, inputs? There's a lot of inputs from chat. We really welcome those. And I like the input around us really calling people from different paradigms to work together. So also inputs from people that are investing, funders that are investing in this work. We really want to see how we can prioritize mental wellness also. Policymakers, government people that are involved in designing policy and programs, we want them to also come in and we work together towards doing this. Eva and Kim, do you have any questions?
I think one of the questions that's come out is just how do you get some of this down to the grassroots level? So often there seems to be such a gap between initiatives like this, Nomfundo, where we start something, we get involved in certain sectors, but how do you actually roll it out to the community who are most in need?
Such a good point. And you'll see when I just do a 2-minute wrap up, one of the key things that we are trying to do with this initiative is to go out and identify the needs on the ground and connect the needs on the ground with the people that are doing the work. Because that's why I'm hoping there is some community-based organizations here. I'm hoping that there are some activists here. I saw Kulumani, I think people that are doing the work on the ground. It will also just be good to hear from them. And if there's any maybe theme that you feel we have not thought of, please also raise that. I'm just going to allow for a few more inputs and then we will move towards
Nomfundo, there's a question from Laura Berg.
Yeah. Hi, Laura. Yes,
hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, just a quick note around shame and humiliation. So we run the Green Light Movement. We've got over 60 organizations from social enterprises, non-profits, and even some groups like Food Lovers Market and other big groups who are participating with their employees. And we're finding that during this period in time, there's been a massive surge in shame and humiliation with communities and people on the ground. People who worked really, really hard for their independence and dignity over the last couple of, decade or so, only through COVID-19 being put way back in terms of regressing where they've come from in terms of their self-worth, because now their hands are out, they're having to ask for food, they're having to ask for support, and they never thought that they were ever going to be in this position again. And it's creating massive feelings of shame and humiliation. It's triggering old wounds. All the old apartheid issues that seem to be rising up are coming through very strongly now. And that's just something I wanted to put on the table. This massive surge of shame and humiliation that's now rolling through our society.
Laura, thank you. That is such a powerful point. I'd always say that at the core of the mental wellness and the healing project in South Africa is the restoration of people's dignity. And I like what you say, COVID has taken us back. And those of you who do the work, you know what shame and humiliation can do to the psyche of a nation. It is literally ripping apart the already fragile psyche that we have. So thank you so much. Karen, I know yes?
We've got another question here. Miran Roy.
Hi, thanks, Eva. I just wanted to raise awareness about our initiative called Frontline Support. We're a group of 20 volunteer art psychotherapists. We're a combination of music therapists, dance movement, drama, and art psychotherapists, volunteering our services online. And we're available to any other organizations who receive referrals to refer on to us. We're offering a range of different interventions, from crisis management to slightly longer term work. And so far, our interventions have been incredibly successful with a lot of people. I think art therapies bring people very much back into their bodies, out of their heads, where people are stressing a lot, because it's partly activity based. But at the same time, the arts activity gives a huge amount of insight to the therapist and the client as to what's really going on. Most of the cases that we're seeing have underlying background issues that have just become unmanageable during lockdown. And I'd also really like to encourage us, please, as a community of practice, to campaign together for free data, so that people who cannot afford data and airtime to access all of our services. I think it's very necessary. We've been gathering a database, but if you guys have got a database, then we can just pool all of that. We're starting to communicate with telecommunications companies, so we're looking for people to assist us with that campaign, please.
Thank you so much, Miran. I really like that. We are already, if there are some of you here who already have databases to share, what we just want is to see how we create synergy. Please do talk to us so that we can pull you in. I'm just gonna allow just only 2 more people. I'm gonna give each one of them a minute. Then there's one last input so that we finish at 2:30 sharp.
I just wanted to speak about, there's just a notion that has been happening. A lot of clinics, when you go there, when you have another problem, they just tell you that they're only focusing on corona. Because I have a friend who went there and wanted to get a prep for the HIV, and they said that's not what they're dealing with now. Their focus is corona. So what concerns me is that it means now other health issues are not of serious importance.
Thank you, Rutabile. And I think Prof. Malusi also raised that thing, that communities were saying they are struggling to access other health services because of it.
Thanks so much, Namfunda. I think one of the things that we as SADAG even saw from overseas is the huge impact of mental health on frontline healthcare workers during COVID-19. And one of the initiatives that we started about 2 months ago, just before the start of lockdown, was one of the magic things that came out of COVID is really just forcing different collaborations and different organizations. And a lot of us that work in the mental health field will understand that there's a lot of working in silos, especially in mental health. One of the magic things that came out was this collaboration amongst a number of different organizations to really focus on the mental health of healthcare workers across the country during COVID. So we're going to be launching in the next week or so. It's an initiative called the Healthcare Workers Care Network. It's a partnership through SASOP, the Psychiatry Association, SAMA, the Medical Association, PSYSA, the Psychology Association, SASA, Anaesthetists, as well as SADAG. What we're looking to do is have a 24-hour helpline, an SMS, and an online platform that any healthcare or frontline healthcare worker, whether they work in the kitchen, they're a community healthcare worker, they're a nurse or a doctor, would be able to access support services through this platform. They'll be able to get pro bono psychology sessions, debriefing. There's also training of hospital and clinic staff, as well as providing psychoeducation through the website and various platforms. The amazing thing is we've already had over 500 volunteer psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, GPs, offering their time to help healthcare professionals around the country. We're going to be launching all the information soon. You can have a look right now on the SAMA website, as well as on the COVID Care Network. We're really looking forward to this, and if anyone has access or would like to get involved, they're welcome to reach out to me on office@anxiety.org.za.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Casey. Someone just pointed to something really important. One of the areas we will need to focus on is on grief counseling, because we haven't reached the peak. I know I was saying, like, what is the peak and what would it mean? Just from the few people that I've talked to and the unresolved grief issues in our society, combined with the humiliation and the shame that we're talking about, I think it will be really good. Any of you that specialize in grief counseling and grief therapy, therapy, please join us also. I just want to close with this last initiative. Casey, can you please just write on chat a bit more? Some people didn't hear about your initiative, what it is, so that they can know. If you can just please write something on chat and your contact details on how people can access you. Thank you so much. So just, I think, just...
Nomfundo,
yes.
just before you go on, if people can just click on the link and fill in that form and indicate what, while it's still visible, please, to in terms of what they're doing and what involvement they would like.
Yeah, it was sent by Tracy. So if you look under Tracy, just please, we need to get those details. So just my last input to just give you a sense of this mental wellness initiative that we're trying to do. We are hoping that this is not our last webinar. We'll have more webinars focusing on more, a little bit more in depth in each of these areas. So what we are really trying to do is to see how we can create more synergy and collaboration and build on already existing initiatives. And what we want to do, someone just mentioned the community of practice. We are really trying to build a community of practice around mental wellness. And as per the presentations, we are looking at how we support leaders, frontline workers, both healthcare workers, and also importantly, Nondumiso mentioned the frontline workers in communities. There isn't sufficient work in relation to that. Support for mental wellness for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and also the at-risk and vulnerable groups that Prof. Langa was talking about in communities that don't have the money and or the data to be able to have online services, but they are the people that are likely to be hit the most. How do we reach them? And we've already identified schools as one of the areas of focus. So Dr. Lynn, thank you for raising that. We are also trying to ensure that these initiatives are sustainable. I mean, as I had said, that I've worked in this field for close to 20 years. There is amazing people in South Africa, great initiatives. But what we need to do now is how do we bring these initiatives together so that we have a whole that is bigger than the parts, and we are able to bring the initiatives. And that includes ensuring that the government plans and initiatives, for example, the people that are now advising the president and the minister of health, do we have a mental health expert today that is talking around how to integrate mental health approaches in their work? We would really like, I know that there are some funders that have joined us here. Unfortunately, because of time, we haven't had time to hear them. But how do we ensure that funders prioritize mental wellness? We've got this ambition of advocating for a mental wellness fund for South Africa that can be accessed by most of you that are here who are too busy doing their work. And I know I direct an NGO, so I know how much fundraising, how much time a fundraising can take, but how do we support you to do your work? And also the private sector, how do we bring it within the private sector priorities, and how do we ensure that the private sector understands that there can be no proper bottom line without the mindset of the people that are doing the work being in the right place. So in closure, just the final slide on my side, please, Eva. So what we then are trying to do with the community of practice is to establish a referral network. That's why we are asking you to fill in the mapping exercise that Kim was just mentioning now. We are trying to identify all of you wonderful people out there doing excellent work, from community-based interventions to mental health practitioners to life coaches. And most importantly, really, we want to create this referral platform for all of us. We want to identify the needs of the most vulnerable people. So please, if you know an area where people are not being reached and there's a need, talk to us. And what we are going to try and do is to link the resources to the need, support you in fundraising, link up with those that are doing the work to ensure that this work is supported. And once we have both the resources and the needs, then we enter the project development and implementation stage. And just to say that right now, we already have 2 areas. Frank, as you get ready, we have 2 areas that projects that we are already developing with practitioners here in Johannesburg and in Western Cape on the schools. Someone mentioned schools. So if you are working on schools, come to us, because the Department of Education had said that they want to offer psychosocial support to scholars, teachers as they go back to school. There's already concept notes we are doing, but also at a leadership level for the 2 metros, eThekwini. I saw someone from eThekwini there, and also in Gauteng, we are wanting to start a project. So all the people that do coaching, we will need you. We are trying to do this at a large scale. So it is an ambitious project, but we believe that we can, as South Africans and the people who've been doing this work. So that just gives you a sense of this initiative that we are trying to do. So thank you, everyone. So I'm just gonna ask now, hand over to Frank in these last 2 minutes to just do closure. For more details, please, on the overall initiative, Frank, details are there. On the mental wellness initiative, you can contact me. You can talk to Casey on mental health, Eva on leadership, Kim on frontline work issues, and Nondumiso on SGBV issues. So Frank, can you please close for us? Thank you everyone for staying. We still have 136 people who stayed despite the Zoom fatigue. Thank you for staying. So just over to you. Are you there, Frank?
So Nomfundo, just again, while we're waiting for Frank, if folk can just register their organization and then the areas that they're involved with, and then potentially which pillars they would like to be involved with, I think that would be really beneficial. Some people have asked how they get access to the database or how they find out who's working in the individual areas.
Okay. So, I mean, we have everyone's details. It's 1 minute before. I know Frank is struggling, but I think in respect of your time for coming on time and joining us, unless Frank is here, we will close. I think he was going to be here to thank everyone. And I want to thank every single person. We've got your database, we've got all of you. I want to salute all of you for the amazing work that you are doing. And we really hope that this work can be prioritized in our country. Because for me, it is about saying that we want South African solutions by South Africans for South Africans. And South Africans, the leadership, the frontline workers, need their psyche to be in the right place. And for me, this is what this is about. It's about saying we must invest in the people of South Africa because they are the solution for us to deal with the devastation that COVID is bringing into our society. I think on that note, I'm going to say thank you, everyone. We are closing the meeting. Thank you for all being here.